Less thinking, more seeing. Buddhist wisdom. Have you ever been exhausted without doing anything physical? You did not run. You did not lift. You sat in a chair or lay in bed, and yet by evening, you felt completely drained. This is the exhaustion of a mind that cannot rest. Most of us spend our lives inside our heads, replaying the past, rehearsing the future, worrying, analyzing, comparing. And somewhere along the way, we came to believe that all this mental activity is necessary, that if we just think hard enough, we will finally figure things out. But is it working? After all those years of thinking, are you more at peace? Or just more tired? Over 2,600 years ago, the Buddha observed something simple. Human beings suffer not because they lack intelligence, but because they cannot stop the mind from churning. And he discovered another way, not through thinking more, but through seeing directly. Less thinking, more seeing. This is not about abandoning intelligence. It is an invitation to discover a different kind of knowing. One that does not wear you out. One that brings clarity instead of confusion. But first, let us look honestly at the problem. Why does thinking, this capacity we are so proud of, so often become a source of suffering? In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha offered a striking image. He said that what people call mind, or intellect, or consciousness arises and ceases constantly, like a monkey swinging through the forest, grabbing one branch, letting go, grabbing another. Never still, never resting, always reaching for the next thing. This was observed 2,600 years ago, and yet it describes modern life with perfect accuracy. You sit down to eat dinner with your family, but your mind is still at work. You go on vacation to rest, but you bring the same busy mind with you. Your body is in one place, your mind in another. Always somewhere else. Always in yesterday or tomorrow. Rarely here. Why can we not stop? Part of the answer lies in a belief that runs deep in modern culture. In the 17th century, the philosopher René Descartes searched for something he could know with absolute certainty. He doubted everything, his senses, his memory, even the existence of the physical world. And he arrived at one thing he could not doubt, the fact that he was thinking. I think, therefore I am. 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐻 ergo sum. The act of thinking proved his existence. This was a brilliant philosophical move, but it left a legacy that shapes us still, often without our knowing. If thinking proves that I exist, then what happens when thinking stops? If I think, therefore I am, then I don't think feels dangerously close to I am not. This is why silence feels uncomfortable. This is why we reach for our phones the moment we are alone. This is why we fill every gap with noise, with stimulation, with something to occupy the mind. We have unconsciously absorbed the idea that our existence depends on our mental activity. So we keep the mind running, afraid of what might happen if it stops. But consider this. If you can notice that you have been lost in thought, if you can recognize that the mind has been wandering, then there is something that is not the wandering itself. There is knowing, and there is what is known. They are not the same. The Buddha's insight was different from Descartes'. He did not say, I think, therefore I am. He pointed to something prior to thinking. The simple fact of awareness itself. Awareness is here before the thought arises, while the thought is present, and after the thought fades. You can know a thought without being that thought. The Buddha also spoke about the cost of excessive thinking. In the 𝐿 Sutta, he described his own experience before awakening. He noticed that whatever he thought and pondered upon frequently became the inclination of his mind. And he noticed something else. If I think and ponder upon this even for a long time, that would tire my body. When the body is tired, the mind is disturbed. A disturbed mind is far from concentration. Even thinking about wholesome things, if done excessively, tires the body and disturbs the mind. This is a practical observation, not a moral judgment. The mind has limits, and much of our thinking tends to circle around memory and anticipation. It rarely rests in what is actually present. This explains why you can spend a whole day doing nothing external and still feel depleted by evening. The mind has been working without pause, and most of that work produced nothing of value, just the same concerns, turning over and over. So what is the answer? Should we try to eliminate thinking altogether? The Buddha never taught that. Thinking is a tool, and a useful one. The question is, which kind of thinking serves us, and which kind only wears us down? If thinking were simply harmful, the Buddha would not have included right resolve as part of the Noble Eightfold Path. In the Samyutta Nikaya, he defined it clearly. Resolve for renunciation, resolve for non-ill will, resolve for harmlessness. These are forms of thinking, ways of directing the mind toward what is beneficial. In another teaching, found in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha spoke of appropriate attention, yoniso manasikara, as central to the entire path. This is thinking that investigates causes and effects, that supports the arising of wisdom. So thinking has an important role. The issue is not thinking itself. The issue is a particular kind of mental activity that the Buddha called papancha. Translators have rendered this in different ways: mental proliferation, objectification, conceptual elaboration. The Madhupindika Sutta explores this in detail. What happens is this: the mind takes one small thing and builds it into an entire drama. You know this experience. Someone does not reply to your message. And from that one small fact, the mind begins to construct. Maybe they are upset. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe they have been wanting to distance themselves for a while now. A whole narrative unfolds, with history, with meaning, with emotional weight, and none of it is verified. It is all generated by a mind that cannot resist elaborating. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha made a direct statement. This Dhamma is for one who delights in non-objectification, not for one who delights in objectification. We tend to find a strange satisfaction in this kind of mental elaboration. It feels productive. It feels like engagement with life. But it produces nothing real, only fatigue and unnecessary suffering. So, less thinking means less of this, less elaborating, less story building, less turning fragments into movies. It does not mean abandoning the capacity to reason or plan or solve genuine problems. It means recognizing when thinking is useful and when you are simply giving the mind more fuel to burn. What do you do when thoughts keep arising? The Buddha offered practical methods. In the Vitakkasanthana Sutta, he described 5 approaches for working with unwholesome thoughts. The first is gentle. Redirect attention to something wholesome. If that does not work, examine the drawbacks of those thoughts. If that fails, try to simply withdraw attention entirely. If that fails, work on stilling the formation of those thoughts. And if nothing else works, he said, with teeth clenched and tongue pressed against the roof of the mouth, one should beat down, constrain, and crush mind with mind. The Buddha was practical. He taught gentle methods first because they usually work and cause less strain. But if you are caught in a powerful pattern, sometimes stronger effort is required. For most situations, though, gentleness is enough. Notice that thinking is happening, not as a problem, but simply as a fact. Let it pass the way a sound passes. Then bring your attention back to something simple and present. The breath, the sensation of sitting, the sounds in the room. The mind wanders. You notice. You return. Patient training, like teaching any skill. No struggle, no judgment. But return to what? When we are not lost in thinking, what are we doing? This is where the Buddha's teaching becomes most interesting. There is another way of knowing. Not through thinking about experience, but through meeting it directly. Imagine a bowl of soup. You could read the recipe. You could study the ingredients, research their origins. Think about how the flavors might combine. You could spend hours analyzing the soup without ever tasting it. And at the end of all that thinking, you still would not know the actual flavor. The only way to know that is to taste it. This is the difference the Buddha pointed to. Thinking about impermanence is not the same as seeing impermanence happening, in this breath, in this sensation, in this moment. One is knowledge about something. The other is direct contact with it. In Theravada Buddhism, there is a traditional way of explaining this. There is understanding that comes from learning, from hearing the teaching. There is understanding that comes from reasoning, from thinking it through carefully. And there is understanding that comes from direct experience, from seeing it for yourself. The first two are valuable. They prepare the ground. But they are not the final step. They are like reading the recipe. Direct experience is tasting the soup. Less thinking, more seeing, points toward that direct experience. It is an invitation to move beyond concepts into contact with what is actually happening. The word the Buddha used for this kind of seeing is vipassana. In Pali, vi means clearly or specially, and passana means seeing. Seeing without the filter of our preferences, our expectations, our stories about how things should be. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha called this the direct path for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, for the realization of unbinding. But what does it actually look like in practice? It is simpler than you might expect. The sutta speaks of being ardent, alert, and mindful, knowing what is happening as it is happening. When you breathe in, you know you are breathing in. When there is a pleasant feeling, you know there is a pleasant feeling. When the mind is restless, you know the mind is restless. Just knowing what is present. This is the most ordinary thing, being aware of what is actually occurring. But we do it so rarely. We are almost always one step removed, occupied with commentary about the experience rather than present to the experience itself. You may have glimpsed this without giving it a name. When you truly listen to someone, not preparing your response, not evaluating, just listening, that is a form of seeing. When you are so absorbed in something that mental commentary falls away, there is seeing. Moments when you suddenly notice you have been lost in thought. That very noticing is seeing. What do we see when attention becomes still? The Buddha spoke of 3 characteristics that mark all experience. The first is impermanence. Anicca. Everything is changing. The breath comes and goes. Sensations arise and dissolve. Emotions appear and fade. Nothing holds still. The second is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but pointing to something broader. It indicates the inherent limitations of anything that depends on conditions. No experience, however pleasant, can provide lasting satisfaction. Not because life is bleak, but because nothing stays the same. The third is anatta, non-self. There is no fixed, unchanging I at the center of experience. There is seeing, but no permanent seer. There is thinking, but no unchanging thinker. This is perhaps the most subtle observation, and the most freeing. When you see these characteristics directly, not as philosophy but in your own experience, something shifts. When there is pain, instead of I am suffering, which creates a story, a victim, a problem to be solved, there is simply a sensation is present. The difference sounds small. Its effect is profound. In the Anattalakkhana Sutta, the Buddha gave his second discourse to the 5 companions who had practiced with him before his awakening. He walked them through each aspect of experience: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. For each one he asked, "Is this permanent or impermanent? If impermanent, is it satisfying or unsatisfying? If impermanent and unsatisfying, can it rightly be regarded as self?" The teaching was methodical, almost repetitive, and yet it led those 5 men to complete liberation. The Sutta records, "Seeing thus, the well-instructed disciple of the Noble Ones grows disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with fabrications, disenchanted with consciousness. Disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is released." Notice the sequence. First, seeing, then disenchantment. Not depression, not rejection of life, but a kind of sobering up. A recognition of the nature of what we have been grasping. Then, dispassion. Not coldness, but the relaxation of that desperate grip. Then freedom. This is what seeing leads to. When you perceive the nature of something directly, holding on loosens by itself. You do not need willpower to release a cup of boiling water. The moment you feel the heat, you let go. The difficulty is that we usually do not feel directly. We are numbed by our stories, our distractions, our constant mental activity. Seeing restores contact, and when contact is restored, we respond naturally. In the Sabbasava Sutta, the Buddha made this explicit. The ending of the effluence is for one who knows and sees, not for one who doesn't know, who doesn't see. The effluents, asavas, are deep patterns of reactivity, sensual craving, craving for existence, ignorance. These release through knowing and seeing, not through wishing, not through belief, not through thinking about them. What does this mean for ordinary life? For the concerns and difficulties that fill our days? When anxiety arises, most of us become absorbed in what might happen, the possible outcomes, the worst-case scenarios. And the more we think, the more anxious we become. But there is another possibility. Notice the anxiety as a physical experience. Feel where it lives in the body, the tightness, the constriction, the quality of the breathing. Watch it, without trying to change it. Notice that it shifts, even slightly. Notice that you can be aware of it without being consumed by it. When someone says something hurtful and a reaction flares up, the habitual response is immediate. Words or actions driven by the intensity of the moment. But with practice, there can be a small space. A moment where you recognize what is arising, feel it in the body, see it as something that is happening rather than a command that must be obeyed. That small space is freedom. You can choose how to respond. When loss comes, and it will come, the mind reaches for explanation. Why is this happening? Who is to blame? What does it mean? But grief does not require a story. Grief can simply be felt, allowed to move through, watched as it changes form. Seeing does not remove the grief, but it changes how you carry it. You are no longer at war with what you feel. Even happiness can be met this way. When joy arises, notice it. Enjoy it fully, but hold it lightly, knowing it will change. This does not diminish the joy. It allows you to be fully present without the anxiety of grasping. There is a quality of stillness that can emerge from this practice. Not emptiness or blankness. Something more like completeness. A sense that nothing needs to be added, that commentary is no longer required. Words become less necessary. Not because there is nothing to say, but because presence is enough. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha gave his final instruction. Knowing he would soon pass away, he told his followers, "Live with yourselves as your island, yourselves as your refuge, with nothing else as refuge. Live with the Dhamma as your island, the Dhamma as your refuge, with nothing else as refuge." This is not about isolation. It is about discovering that what you are seeking is not far away. The clarity you long for, the peace you hope to find, it is available in seeing what is right here. You do not need permission. You do not need perfect circumstances. You do not need to become someone else first. You do not have to believe any of this. You do not have to accept it because it comes from an ancient tradition or because anyone tells you it is true. You can see it for yourself, right now. One breath, and see.